Okay, thank you all so much. So before we begin, I would like to do a brief overview of Zoom, of the Zoom format in this presentation. So please note that everybody's microphones are muted by me. This is set at a default just to eliminate disruptions. As far as the view of Zoom, you can switch between speaker view and gallery view. So the speaker view will give you like the large view of the person who is speaking, and if they're sharing their screen, and then gallery view will let you see everybody. So for the first portion of our presentation, so for the first hour, I recommend that you use speaker view because some of our presenters will be sharing some their screens and some PowerPoint slides maybe, or some other information. And then the last half an hour we'll have more of a discussion, and you're welcome to use gallery view for that, but it's always your choice what view you're using. Okay. So this webinar is being recorded. So all of you who are here today will receive an email with a recording link if you need to revisit it or share it with others. So this will be accessible on YouTube. And it'll be free for everybody. You do not have to be an AGPA member to be able to access it. And a few words about how the webinar is being structured. So I asked our speakers to share with us today their theoretical framework for working with diversity in groups and how they work on their own identity development. And I also asked them to share some of interventions they use in groups and in supervision to address diversity-related issues. So each speaker will take about 15 minutes to share their approach and experiences with us. And after each presentation, there will be a couple of minutes for questions for that speaker. And then after all speakers go, the last 30 minutes will be reserved for discussion of clinical cases from the audience. So that being said, you have the opportunity to ask for input from our speakers today. On a situation that you've encountered in your groups with university students, a situation related to diversity or anything challenging or anything like that. So that'll be the last 30 minutes. And my hope is that we can do maybe 3 clinical examples. I know 30 minutes is kind of limited. Okay, so with that being said, let's begin, and I'll turn it over to Nathasha to get us started.
Thank you so much, Ksenia. I appreciate that. I'm extremely excited to share about the topics at hand today, and really excited to be here alongside Karen and Michele. So let me see if I can start here. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? So I think one of my biggest challenges this evening will be to share everything that's on my mind when I think about all of these topics, but I will certainly try my best to be as succinct as I can. Before I go into the presentation, just want to kind of preface that we were asked to talk about our experiences. So I want to share what we're doing at my particular agency in the work that we do there. A quote that I heard recently that really I feel resonates in the work that we do around microaggressions and group therapy include this quote that I have at the bottom of the screen for those who can see. When we see oppression and do not act to change it, we are engaging in an act of oppression. And so that's kind of like some of the framework that I'm thinking about as I am thinking about like, okay, do I act on something? Do I not? And being mindful of what it means when I don't. So there's a little bit of information about myself. One of the things that I didn't share before is a bit about my framework, which is using a social justice framework. I operate from a social justice framework in that school of thought because I feel like our roles as mental health providers really should go beyond helping someone cope with their stressors, particularly if those stressors are related to their oppressed identities in society. Aside from empowering someone to make change in, themselves and in their societies, we as providers must use our skills and knowledge to help guide change beyond that individual level and the group levels, but also at communal and systemic levels as well. And so today I'm going to focus on how that can look more so on the group therapeutic level. It's really important to me to try to elevate the voices of those that are often oppressed when they're in group therapy, whether those identities are present in the room or not. Sometimes there may be statements that are made that may not reflect any of the identities of the room, but I still feel like it's important to speak on that. Also using the power and role that I have as a therapist to role model for those who may hold more privileged identities on how to yield that power, acknowledge missteps, and to create space for those with different lived experiences. When I think about the importance of this work, I think about the fact that in our groups on college campuses, we have future corporate execs, we have future judges, law enforcement officers, educators, parents, a lot of different roles. And so I think it's so important to make sure that we're intentional with how we use our work and our influence. So that's a bit of the framework that I operate from. And so, I'm presenting a little bit on a microaggression safety plan, which is what we use at Florida International University's Counseling and Psychological Services. And so a bit about that rationale comes back to, as a psychologist, the ethical principles that we operate from, and just looking at how that overlaps with social justice, thinking about our principles of benefiting those that we work with, but also taking care to do no harm. That's one of the conundrums that comes up sometimes when we are experiencing a microaggression as a group facilitator. We're like, how do we balance all of these different needs that our group has? We don't want to harm anyone, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're helping others. And sometimes that can feel like it's in conflict. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that kind of goes into some of that social justice piece of making sure that we are trying to balance those things. We have a sense of responsibility, particularly to go beyond to make sure that we're fulfilling the best interests of those with whom we work. And so being mindful of what that looks like when we're providing services to them, but also in the different layers and levels around them that impact them, just being mindful about how is what I'm doing now going to impact their best interest, whether they directly are the recipient of that or someone perhaps with a shared identity, just knowing that we have that responsibility. And then, of course, justice, particularly being mindful of potential biases, the boundaries of competence, limitations of expertise, and how that could potentially harm someone or create an unjust practice if we're not being attuned to that. And so when you're thinking about those things, it's like, okay, maybe perhaps having a plan to make sure that we can balance those challenges that come up in group and making sure that we are engaging in just practices is important. When we're thinking about microaggressions, a lot of us know that to be behavior or speech that can cause harm. And when we're thinking about safety plans, that's something that's usually designed to keep a client safe from irreparable harm. And so just thinking, okay, if I am going to be providing this service, there's a lot that I have to balance. I want to be mindful of my biases. How can I operate in a way that can be best fit for those that I'm treating? And so the microaggression safety plan that I utilize uses the acronym PAUSE, which is P for prepare, A for approach with curiosity and address the comment, U_goals, S, safety without scapegoating, and E, elevating to a group level. So I want to go into the prepare. One of the handouts that I use is called the Reflections of a Microaggression. And it's an exercise that can be done individually, but it's designed to be done with your co-facilitator. This is actually inspired by work from Karen, one of the panelists. I was exposed to the trainee trainer questionnaire that she uses and that she created. And it's an activity that you're supposed to do as a supervisor with someone that you're providing supervision for. And it's a way to have structured questions to kind of get a sense of how we operate and a bit of hypotheticals. And so I was like, it'd be great to have something like this for microaggressions, even with co-facilitators, or it could be with someone that you provide supervision with. Because, sometimes when we're in the moment, it's a little bit late to be thinking about like, how do I want to navigate this? Similarly to how we structure safety plans for clients that we're concerned about, we want them to have a plan beforehand. And even as a facilitator of group or as a therapist, it's really helpful to have one of these. And so I have an example here of what this handout looks like. And I won't go too much into it, but it encourages people to take time to think about how they typically respond to microaggressions, which ones are harder for them to manage. If they tend to hesitate, what is that informed by? How can they work through that? trying to revisit times that microaggressions have happened in the past, perhaps when they were a facilitator, what went well, what didn't go well. If none come to mind, maybe what are we missing that is preventing us from really being attuned to microaggressions that are happening in our groups, because they do happen. And then also, like this last portion here, talking with your co-facilitator about like, okay, if a microaggression were to happen that would target my identity, how would I want my co-facilitator to show up for me? How would they perhaps want me to show up for them? What if my co-facilitator is the one that issues a microaggression? How do we talk about that? So reviewing some of these concepts in advance is really essential and helpful with the P, which is the preparation stage. So also identifying interventions that fit your identity, values, and style is also important. I know that that's something that is very helpful for me. And also getting comfortable with talking about the things that make you uncomfortable. I believe it's kind of a fallacy to believe that if we're not actively talking about difficult conversations, and diversity and areas of identity often are difficult for us to talk about. I think it's a fallacy to believe that when it comes up in group, if we're not talking about it in other places, all of a sudden we're going to have a really great, warm intervention. And so it's important for us to kind of get comfortable with talking about these things. And so for myself, I know I seek supervision and consultation as needed. People are encouraged to join an accountability group or healing space. You know, I'm a part of a healing space, participating in trainings and seeking additional education, particularly around multicultural competency, power, privilege, and social justice, and then also knowing your triggers. So all of these things are important, and you know, lucky for those who are here and who are watching this, we're already in the P stage, which is preparation, which is really good. But again, in this acronym, the first level is prepare. So when a microaggression actually does come into place, you're like, okay, I already have a plan in place. The next letter is A, approaching with curiosity and addressing the comment. So you certainly want to, you know, plant a seed for the person to think like, okay, well, maybe what I intended to communicate was not adequately received by the person that I meant to share that with, or maybe there was something that they intended to communicate, and now they're really, you know, having an opportunity to step a little bit deeper and to understand, okay, why am I wanting to communicate this? And so there are a few examples that are listed here. What did you mean by that? This stood out to me, could you share more? And sometimes even just reflecting the comment and asking for clarification if that's what the person intended to communicate. It's also important to address the comment. You know, there are certainly implications if the comment is not addressed. There's research done by Hook et al. That really looks at cultural humility of the therapeutic providers. And they were able to see that when a student, because this was done on the college campus, when a student is able to detect that their provider issued a microaggression or a microaggression was present, and if it wasn't addressed, that actually reduced their therapeutic outcomes and impacted the therapeutic relationship. So there certainly are consequences if comments are not addressed or behaviors are not addressed. And there are a few examples that are here. You know, one experience that I had a couple weeks ago in my group, there was a lot of discussion around relationships. And because I did some of my group screenings, I knew some of the identities that were in the room, but they weren't being spoken about. And I was very mindful about the students that weren't participating in that conversation about relationships. And so, you know, one of the interventions that I used was, you know, I've been hearing a lot of language around heteronormativity in regards to relationships. It's important for us to know that, you know, there are a variety of different types of partnerships that may be present in the room or that are present in the world. And, you know, there are some relationships that also aren't partnerships, because I knew one of the students that we had was also in a polyamorous relationship. So like there, you know, this is just an example of, you know, a way that you can say that, kind of plant a seed, even if it's not just one comment, but maybe a variety of comments, just being mindful about the things that you're picking up on. And there are several different examples that are there as well. And so the group facilitator can approach in a variety of different ways. We can provide context sometimes as to why a statement could have had an offensive impact to someone, or maybe we can share insight on how that statement could have impacted someone, or we can disclose our own reactions. And I give some examples of this moving forward. So you would be underscoring goals. I feel like this is a huge tool that I really like to use when I know that I'm getting ready to approach a microaggression. Sometimes I ask for permission from the person to kind of explore what I know that I'm getting ready to explore with them. And I want to make sure that my feedback is rooted in my role and in my intentions as a facilitator. Oftentimes, using MI techniques, it gets the student buy-in and saying like, okay, I am here to learn, I am here to grow. And, my facilitator asked for this permission, I agreed. So, now it kind of removes some of that defensiveness because it's more of a cooperation and we're transparent and intentional about what's happening. So sometimes you want to think about goals on the member level. So for a particular student, you may say, say the person's name is CJ. CJ, you shared wanting to be less judgmental and approachable. I invite you to consider how specified comment may tie into ways that people are experiencing you in here. Or even if you want to bring it back to the goal of the discussion. So for example, earlier we were identifying connections between us as members of the group. I wonder how people experienced this comment. Did people experience this comment as deepening connection? And there is also, there are many goals on the group level. And so in the sections that I have coming up, I'll specify which ones are kind of really good group level goal discussions to have or interventions to have. So for S, you want to create safety without scapegoating, which kind of goes back to doing no harm, but also trying to create benefit for those who are in need of protection and support. And it is a bit of a balance, but it's certainly doable. There was an incredible presentation from Dr. Belcher-Platt, who talked about in her presentation about Black Lives Matter in therapy groups too. She discussed a medical triage approach when you're thinking about who's in the room and who to help first. And so when you think from the top, you're like, okay, those who have severe injuries, those are the ones that you want to tend to first. These individuals are likely the person who was targeted by the comment. Then you would go to those who might be experiencing serious injury. In this case, it might be bystanders, and in some ways that could be group members, that also could be someone you're facilitating the group with. And then you want to tend to those with minor injuries, and that could be the person who issued the microaggression. And so a particular example could be, I hear you getting defensive as we discussed the comment that you made. I want to be clear that my intentions are to make the group safe for all of us to engage. However, I'm sorry, and it's important for me to make this space safe for you too. However, if it's okay with you, I would like to first check in on those who may have been impacted by that comment. And so, I put this piece there because sometimes there is defensiveness that can come up, and highlighting like you want to be that person's therapist, you want to be the therapist of all the members of the group, and you want everyone to be safe. So individuals and group safety is being considered. And again, there's some of that permission asking there so the person understands like, this is collaborative. I'm a part of what's happening and trying to come to a resolution with what was said. Another example of how to create safety without scapegoating, really, when you're thinking about safety, oftentimes there are elements of power that are a part of that discussion, whether they're named or unnamed. And so it's okay to name where the power is, and you want to be mindful to try to give power to the person who may have been on the receiving end of a particular behavior or comment. And so when you're thinking, the power is targeted persons to decide if they want to address this comment and how. And I trust and respect that they will use this power as they decide. And as group members, our focus is on our roles in this conversation and what we do and don't say and its impact on the group. And as a group facilitator, I can say that I had a reaction. And so that's just a brief example here. I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to skip forward. Let's see if I can skip forward there. A few more examples. So if we sense that our focus is on what we feel rather than what the person impacted by our comments may feel, then this would be a good time to pause, step outside of that feeling, to listen and to learn. I also really like to bring it back to the group screenings where we have discussions about these potential situations happening. So during our group screenings, we agreed to create a safe space for everyone to bring all of their identities into the room. I'm wondering if we could take a moment to reflect on how our language has created or eroded the sense of safety in this conversation. So moving to letter E, you want to elevate to the group level or to the group process. So oftentimes, if there was a particular exchange, you might, address it with the individuals who were targeted or were issuing the aggression. But eventually, you want to bring this up to the group level because everyone is impacted when such statements are made in a group. And so, and that again could include co-facilitators or members of the group. And so bringing it to a group level and not leaving it there is also something that helps to prevent the scapegoating as well. And it also prevents putting undue attention on a particular individual who may feel like there's a lot of pressure for them to speak, and they're trying to decide what they want to do with that. You also want to consider the stage of the group, and the work that I did with Dr. Shamika Brooks. She talked a lot about considering the stage of the group and how that impacts the type of interventions you're going to make, particularly around microaggression. So that's something you want to be thoughtful of as well. And so this is a little bit of the pause framework here. And again, the word here or the acronym here is pause, but you definitely want to pause and address. But P, you want to prepare, think about ways that you can handle microaggressions in group therapy. You want to approach with curiosity and address the comment. What would approaching with curiosity look like for me? What would be my style when naming microaggressions as a group therapist? Underscoring goals. What are the goals of the members and of the group that I believe are important to emphasize when a microaggression occurs? Safety without scapegoating. What methods can I use in group therapy to increase the safety of the most injured by a microaggression, as well as bystanders while reducing scapegoating? And then E, elevating to the group level. What interventions do I want to consider to transition member interactions around microaggressions, processing the impact on the group level? So this is another document that we use at my agency in addition to the reflections on microaggressions as a group facilitator. And this is essentially, as a facilitator of group, your own safety plan so that you kind of have like an idea of what you plan to do. Trying to wrap up here. So managing diversity dialogues, particularly with the election come up, we can anticipate that there will be a lot of cross information and cross talk, and particularly being in Florida, which is a very popular swing state, and there's lots of discussion around politics all the time. Just really concerned about how this will look in our groups at our agency. We encourage people to use I statements when you're giving feedback to individuals, and we encourage group members to do the same as well when they can. Also addressing the behavior in the statement, not the person when possible, and then acknowledging the impact of your identities and of your privileges. When my group is talking about Black Lives Matter, for example, and even if I have a follow-up question, I have to perhaps acknowledge, like, I also understand that me asking you this might have a particular significance because I am a Black woman. Like, what does that mean for you as an individual as I ask you this? And then just a few more examples here that people can potentially use. I know which ones I'll be using or anticipating to. So just from the outset of the conversation, just being clear, I want to make everyone feel heard today. However, even as a facilitator, I may make a misstep. If that happens, I want you to share how I impacted you. Also, the world is filled with echo chambers or debates. This space is different. What can we each do today to listen to each other? What will we each need to feel heard? And then what about your lived experiences informs the way that you are feeling right now? That third one, I know I'm definitely planning on using that because I can imagine a lot of emotions will be coming into the room, probably the week of the election with my students. And then on my final slide here, if there's a sense of not being compelled to better understand others in this discussion, invite the group to help you explore what's underneath that for you. As I can imagine, a lot of students might be checking out or might be disengaging in their own reinforced thoughts about their beliefs. And then also, as folks discuss the election, what fears are we holding about what the election outcomes mean for you, your loved ones, in your day-to-day life? So really just getting that person to reflect on what's coming up for them. And then in the event that there is, elevated emotion, this last one here, we can disagree in this space, but we cannot attack each other. How can we take the strong feelings that we're feeling right now and take risks to try things differently? So, I definitely will share more after, this point here, but just wanted to, give a little bit of thoughts about what I have so far.
Thank you, Nathasha. I'm getting questions from the audience. Are you willing to share the PowerPoint with people who are present here today?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yes.
so then the PowerPoint will be coming in the email along with the link to the recording for everybody. And so we'll just take 1 minute. Any quick questions for Nathasha before we move on to the next presentation? And you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question.
If there are questions at the end, I can also take them as well, if any come up for folks.
Okay, well, let's move on with the interest of time. So Karen, why don't you have us continue?
Okay, and I do not have a PowerPoint, and now I feel nervous, but that's okay. I already felt nervous. But I was thinking about this, and one of the foundations of my life, both professionally and personally, is I always think about how do I go about fostering my shared humanity with others and celebrating, at the very least, respecting, honoring, and accepting our differences. And so I approach groups with a very similar mindset. And the theory, and I hate that, it brings back just memories of, oh no, I need to articulate this because I'm applying for a job or internship or whatever. But briefly, the overarching theory that I really like is Uri Bronfenbrenner's model of ecological, I can't even remember what it's named. What is his name? I wrote it down somewhere. The ecological systems model. Thank you. And the reason that's so appealing to me is each of us is our own special individual. And we come into this world with certain dispositional traits that then get influenced by our environments. And, you know, like our family environment, our community, our society, the different things going on in the world when we're born. And so I like to look at all of these different pieces because for me, intersectionality is key. You know, people look at me and they see a certain thing. By the way, I was called elderly the other day by a client and I loved that. I love the wiseness, I guess, associated with being elderly. But anyhow, I really like to look at all these systems in which we are operating, especially in group. And in the US, I just make the assumption that all of us are deeply impacted and have internalized white supremacy as the system, to the point where I don't even think about it. And I loved when Michele, who is also a speaker here today, just so artfully depicted it for me. And it's like, yeah, that, oh yeah, that, I do that, in breaking down the system of white supremacy. So I continue to keep learning about that. But in groups, I always like to look at not only my individual identity and the different identities of the people in the group, including co-facilitators, because for me in society, I have positions that, or I have identity statuses that might be relatively subordinated or marginalized by the mainstream. But in the group, I like to look at my position. And in my agency, my position is I'm a licensed psychologist, permanent clinical staff. I am in a supervisory role. I am in an educator role. And so in my agency, I hold, my positions hold a degree of power. A lot of the trainees and supervisees that I'm working with, their social identities actually hold more power than my social identities. But for me, my position of power as that permanent staff who has the power to evaluate and all this really comes into play in everything that I do, to the point where this year, I guess doing things through Zoom or whatever, but it's been really challenging because I have been personally challenged in some of the different trainings and whatnot that I do. And I have to remember, okay, notice you're feeling defensive, notice you're feeling attacked, that's important, and use it as an example in this group process. If you're gonna, i.e. me, if I am gonna say that, yes, I hold all kinds of subordinated identities, and in this group, I'm a leader, like in my process groups that I do, I'm a leader. So I really do have a lot of power. And that's what I like to, that's what I like to foster in our trainees and in my co-facilitators. And so in that, I am constantly working on my awareness of my own identities and privilege. And I've noticed throughout my life, my ability to not only be aware, but truly embrace some of the identities that I have that are privileged. You know, I've really grown a lot throughout my development, and I will continue to grow until I die. So I try to remember sometimes, or no, I always try to remember, when I can remember, that other people are at different levels of their own development. And I try to have compassion for where they're at, so that I can, when I'm approaching them, do that in a very compassionate way. And throughout life, I have learned that that compassion that I can give really easily to others is super important for me. And I really always said, oh yeah, self-compassion, and I do that, but I really hadn't been. And so I noticed that I can hold myself accountable for all the missteps that I take. That's easier for me to do than it is to give myself self-compassion. I wrote something down. Oh yeah, so part of this self-compassion piece, along with the accountability piece, is through this process of continually looking and growing and being introspective, while it's painful, and I'm so open to hearing how I have transgressed, and then I process my pain elsewhere, and then use it to grow. What's been harder for me is to recognize the importance of me having self-compassion in this work. So not only experiencing the pain, but also saying, yeah, you know what? And you didn't know better. So sitting here and beating yourself up, is that helpful? It's usually not. But anyhow, by doing this, I have honestly been able to overcome many, many hurt feelings that I have in painful interpersonal situations, which at the end of the day has increased my resilience. And in doing this work, I have started to recognize that I don't need to continue belonging and contributing to groups where I feel like, I'm very stressed and feeling a lot of pain, and I'm not experiencing growth. I'm learning to leave those kinds of groups. It doesn't mean forever, but it means like right now, it's not a growthful space for me. And so therefore, I'm not going to be contributing to growth of anyone else. And one of the really key pieces for me is very recently in my life. So I'm 59, I'm almost 60. But I was very recently, a few years ago, assessed for and diagnosed with ADHD. And that invisible status has had a huge impact on me. First of all, I couldn't believe it. I thought, no, I don't, that's just excuses. No, I mean, yeah, maybe I have it, but I'm not going to use it as excuses. And through just my continued introspection, I can see how that status has impacted me throughout life. And then I internalized, oh, you're being so sensitive. Or, oh my God, why can't you just be on time? Oh, geez, why are you so disorganized? And now I understand that it truly is because my brain is different. And I still feel like, oh, am I using that as an excuse when I can't get things done or I can't organize things more beautifully? And I'm not. And so I have to continually educate myself about neurodiversity. I thought I knew a lot because I can do neuropsych evals, but no, I don't know a lot. I have to continue learning. And then, yeah, and so for me, that's very important as a group facilitator, as a trainer, and I'm keeping an eye on the time because that's another thing I struggle with. And particularly during COVID, time really has no meaning for me. And probably later I can talk more specifically about some of the different interventions. But when Nathasha was giving that pause model, I was like, oh man, this is beautiful. And I can give an example of recently a very difficult interaction that occurred in a process group that I do for people who are living with severe and persistent mental health conditions. So in this group, and the group, it varies at level of development because people can come and they can go. But this particular member that I'm going to talk about has been in the group for probably 3 years. And this person identifies as a cisgender male, a Latinx. He is of non-traditional age. I don't know explicitly sexual orientation, but anyhow, he initially told me at the group screen, I don't know, I don't think this group's going to work, but I'll give it a try, because he had run out of his sessions for individuals. So group, there's no session limit in our agency. So he came in and utilized group in a way that I thought, this isn't what group's about, because you're mostly using it as a support group. But I didn't push him. And through the years, he's grown more and more comfortable, has taken ownership of the group, and has been able to share definitely places where he's been wounded by like the more privileged and higher positioned people in life. And in his case, it's particularly white, straight, cisgender males who belong to the predominant religion. And I'm in Utah, so that's Latter-day Saint. Those are the ones that he just felt so much anger towards and whatnot. And in group very recently, just this past summer, he was saying and doing things that I could notice the women in the group, and the ones that were there that day, all identified as women of color, were becoming more and more checked out or more and more whatnot. So I paused him for a minute and I said, I just want to pause you for a minute. But what do you think is going on with the other people in this virtual room? And he was like, oh, okay. Yeah, it looks like maybe they're, basically checked out. And one of his things that he wants to work on is interpersonal relationships outside, and why do people seem to be peeved with him or whatnot. And so I took a risk because I know the relationship that we have. And I said, I just want to, would you be open to hearing what their perspectives are? And he said yes. And they let him know, like, you're not aware, in a nicer way, I'm just trying to wrap up for time. You're not aware that you monopolize the group. You're not aware that you interrupt people. You're not aware that you don't really follow what's going on. And he was shocked and he started to defend himself. And so I just said, I notice, of course, you didn't mean to hurt anybody. And let's just take that. But I want you to notice what it's like to pay attention to how you've actually impacted others. And then he said, well, I feel shitty. Not so quickly, it took time. And then, and I said, well, that totally makes sense. And you know how much people in here care about you. They've expressed it. So anyway, he came back the next week, which was amazing. And usually at check-in, he'll say, oh yeah, I've been okay. But this time after that painful group, he goes, actually, I've been feeling shitty all week. I'm even wondering if this group is any benefit to me anymore. But he stayed and was able to receive true caring from others and able to hear how that his way of being in group is probably what is alienating people out there. And it was a real turning point. And when he said he felt shitty, I said, I know this might sound cruel, but I want to say that I'm actually really glad that you felt shitty, because to me that represents just a huge and quantum leap in your own development. But I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time, and I want to leave time for questions at the end.
Thank you, Karen. So it looks like maybe we're going to questions at the end scenario. So let's just switch that a little bit from the original plan, as in which was questions after each speaker. So let's move on to Michele, and then we'll do any questions if they come up for anybody, and then we'll also move on to discussing some of the cases from the audience. So thank you so much, Karen. Michele, I'm giving the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm learning so much, so I'm really excited to be here to learn from both Nathasha and Karen. So thank you so much. I am going to, my PowerPoint is probably not as wonderful as Natasha's, but I'm going to share stuff because it'll help me stay linear as well, because I can kind of go all over the place. I want to just highlight first that a lot of this is very near and dear to my heart, this work, particularly around racial justice, and growing up in North Carolina and being in an area where with the military, it was fairly diverse. And so I love the idea of putting experience with theory. And so I have two books that I wanted to highlight: The College Counselor's Guide to Group Psychotherapy, which really weaves diversity issues. And I'm going to actually reference Karen and my other colleague, Ari, in one of my slides. But then this is a new one, Examining Social Identities and Diversity Issues in Group. And there's a lot of great chapters in this book, particularly around intersecting identities, gender, sexual orientation, ability status, lots of great chapters in there, not articles, but chapters. And so I want to highlight both of those. If you want to go a little bit more in depth, they're wonderful chapters. The next I want to start is with this quote, because I really feel like it's relevant. We can't control, as we know in today's society, we can't control what's going on us, but we do have some power. And so through adverse situations, we cannot direct the wind, but we do have the power to adjust the sails. So my way of doing group is to try and figure out how the wind is blowing and how to try and use whatever power or whatever things that come to mind in the moment. And the same with that, I'm going to be talking about, there's been more of a move, and Rhonda McGee brings more of mindfulness to the social justice work. So I'll be bringing in some mindfulness. It's really also very true to what I try to live up to. I don't always succeed in that, but bringing more and more mindfulness to the social justice movement, I think, is really valuable. So I'll be focusing a little bit on that as well. So who are my key ancestors in this work? Racial identity theory, again, because I came from a family where it wasn't highly educated. And so being exposed to theory was really, really powerful for me. And in 1993, I took my first multicultural counseling class. and was exposed to Sue and Sue. So Sue was a key figure in my growth and development. William Cross, Janet Helms, Poston on biracial identity theory, historical and intergenerational trauma. The January 2019, I believe it, no, 2020 of Lillian Gomez Diaz, Helen Neville, amazing articles on trauma and historical, looking at the historical and intergenerational through many different populations. Anti-Black racism. I was exposed to this in the course that Dr. Della Mosley and Paris Wheeler, phenomenal. I highly recommend you take that course. It just helped me grow in my own awareness so much more. Dismantling white supremacy culture, because I don't just see myself as a psychologist, I also see myself as a larger student affairs practitioner. Really kind of like Karen, looking at systems and trying to understand how I play into them intentionally or unintentionally. So Tama Akun's work really guides my thinking today. William Parham, Joe White, Robert Carter, Beverly Tatum, Shakti Butler, Lee Mun-Hwa. I use a lot of their videos in the trainings. Michele Fine, William Ming Liu. He first brought in more and more of class into looking at diversity issues. They're not so new anymore, but 2017 Multicultural Guidelines of CC, Klaus Ehlers, Gargi Rauskiar, and Intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw. I also want to recognize my teachers. This is my 25th year of learning Vipassana meditation. So S.N. Gwenka, B.K.S. Iyengar, and Tara Brock. So I'll be kind of weaving in and out of some of those amazing teachers. I, like Karen, we're kindred souls, really appreciate the ecological systems model. So I just wanted to highlight this. I think all of us know this, but I really do value looking at the non-linear. It's like really bi-directional of how the individual as a therapist meets with the individual as the client, and then the group members, the subgroups, and all of these impeding, as well as the larger systems in our society, in the globe. So all of these are impeding on us all of the time, whether we are aware of them or not. I also am bringing more and more into my work right now. I'm doing a dismantling, well, it's actually called Building Anti-Racism Stamina Group for white students. And we're really taking a look at how the body holds trauma. And Resme Menachem, he talks about white body supremacy and Black bodies and police bodies. And so I'm really trying to, I don't necessarily introduce this into all my groups. I have introduced it to working with white students, again, because I do just not just therapy work with students. I also do kind of psychoeducational work. So being able to help them understand the fight or the flight of what happens when we talk about these issues of race. And the work of Robin DiAngelo and about fragility and what shuts us down, and where we really are trying to stay in is the window of transformation. So I'm trying to think more and more of how to teach students to recognize when they go into a frozen state and a fear state, so they can begin to slow down their processes, use mindfulness to ground themselves, and move from that center instead of a center of fear or frozen. The other is highlighting, this comes from Morgan. She has continued to add to it, but again, this notion of intersectionality and how important it is, and particularly for white students, there's often, if they hold one marginalized identity, such as, let's say, being female, there is this tendency to kind of go to that marginalized identity. And so I'm really trying to help students be able to name the many different identities and where they may hold privilege. I want to, this kind of moves into working with supervisees and myself as well. Again, using Dr. Helms's racial interaction theory, that a therapist can be at the parallel of understanding as their clients. And so that could be at a lower racial identity development, or it could be at a higher, but that would be a fairly safe place to be. What we don't want is a regressive where our clients are actually knowing more, and we are relying on them. And so the ideal for all of us, and yet it requires a lot of work to stay up because things are changing so much, is this progressive, where we as therapists are constantly doing our own work. So we can recognize where we hold biases, where we hold areas where we can't see outside of our myopic socialization, to be able to understand, at least have the ability to not have our clients only educate us, but we do some education prior to that. So again, I use a lot of the multicultural and social justice competence principles for group workers. Singing colleagues, they had a great special edition. So kind of turning to those, and the key aspect of these guidelines is to attend to differences in acculturation levels, racial cultural identity, and multiple intersecting identities. This I just want to highlight to lovely Karen and Ari. These are questions that I bring into the pre-group meeting. And so where I tend to try to do most of my work is start to talk to these clients about what is their knowledge of identity and what identities are salient for them. I'm going to show you another one that I do less outside of the group work, but I thought more and more about bringing it in. But I do ask these questions in the pre-group screen. And then in the first group, I'll have people name and I'll model for them some salient identities for me. And then they go around and are willing to share what their identities are. I always like to show this because this is a nice, I just did it actually with my anti-racism group for white students. And we really looked at it for about an hour and just learning about, you know, it's so common to me now, but it's so fascinating when I sit with students, and we're talking senior to first year student, of how unaware they've been in looking at aspects of their gender even. Or aspects of socioeconomic class, and being able to talk to them about the intersectionality of where they might hold privilege. So with them, it's to kind of say that you are more than just your race, and yet the race plays a very important role in how you show up. So I don't do this, I haven't done this so much with my interpersonal process groups. I just kind of bring it in question format, but this is something that I'm thinking more and more to bring in. So when issues come up around identity, that we have more language and there's a little bit more exposure before it just comes into group. What I want to highlight, and I'm writing about this right now, is using Tara Brach's RAIN. And this is going to give you some examples of how it can be utilized in the group. And this is, again, utilizing the idea of mindfulness. So R stands for recognize. So recognizing is about acknowledging what you're experiencing in the moment and just being fully in it. So one intervention that the therapist could say is, I wonder what feelings might be coming up as we reflect on what was just shared by members in our group and how members have responded. So that could be a really simple intervention for anything, but it is particularly helpful for when you're dealing with difficult conversations around racism or sexism or anything that might, again, cause the body to get activated in heated ways, or again, shutting down. The next is allow, allowing one to be present with whatever emotions surface in the moment. So something the therapist could say is, perhaps there are a variety of emotions in the room right now as we discuss race and gender, for example. So I wonder if we can just be present with these feelings rather than trying to run away or shut down. The next is investigate. What is causing me to have this emotion? The therapist could ask, what would happen to each of us in our group as a whole if our emotions of fear, anger, confusion were allowed to be here without resisting them? The next is not identifying with, seeing the truth of our emotions as the truth, just a mix of bodily sensations and thoughts coming and going. So one sentence the therapist could say is, the experience of tension is working through me as I face the fear as a white person socialized to not talk about race. Can anyone in the group relate with experiencing tension as it relates to emotions that are coming up around discussions of being white or around racism or whatever you can put it in, and what that means for you? And the last one, actually, this comes from another one out of UCLA, the Mindfulness Institute. This is a nurture. So RAIN, with just RAIN, comes from Tara Brach, but the added RAIN is nurture. So nurturing ourselves and others through compassion and loving kindness. It is about asking, how can we be kind to ourselves and each other in the midst of all of this confusion, fear, anger, whatever emotion might be coming up for you or the group. So I know all of us probably talk about a lot of self-compassion and about making mistakes. And so what Nathasha was talking about with microaggressions, I'll bring those in the pre-group meeting. I'll ask them to say, do you know what a microaggression is? And just kind of hear what they have to say. And then I say, you know, inevitably they may show up in our group like they do in society. And so we can't necessarily stop them from happening, but are you agreeing to work through them to understand that the impact might be different than the intent? And I actually have added it to my contract as part of the pre-group meeting, that they are agreeing to stay engaged in microaggressions if they happen. And then I just wanted to share, because I am always thinking about my staff too, and the dynamics on my staff, and in different groups that I'm in that's just not the clinical realm. I just wanted to highlight a few of Tama Akun's white supremacy culture cards. We use this a lot in examining white identity. So power hoarding, and I take a look at, so I'm constantly going to workshops, I'm constantly just exposing myself to experiential learning opportunities. So I look at myself too, like, how am I power hoarding? How am I doing this with my supervisee? If we're co-facilitating a group, how am I doing this in staff meeting? And really she's laid them out really nicely. It's on the next page, you'll see it's DR, Dismantling Racism Works website. It's all free and available, of just being able to take a look at yourself constantly in the group sphere. So fear of open conflict, and how we're taught as whites, except for if you're from the Northeast, which I've spent a lot of time, then we can be in conflict and it's okay. But there's often, at least in the Pacific Northwest, conflict is not always welcomed, or the Midwest is not always welcomed. And so that is like, how can we understand? And generative somatics talks about moving into conflict as a good sign, as not something that's negative. This idea of individualism instead of looking at the impact on the group. Belief in objectivity and neutrality, that there really isn't objectivity. Right to comfort, and that usually is about people who hold the privilege, that we don't have to think about those things. And then defensiveness. So when something does come up, or we do get invited to look at something we might say, that we might recognize again that what happens, do we go into this place of fear or shutting down? And how do we kind of look at that in the moment to try and be curious rather than get defensive and shut down? So that is, and that's just a clinical example. This is just kind of looking at biases of group work and taking understanding of how certain things that we've always done in the group world. And I think we're gonna actually have to overhaul a lot of group theory, because I think it comes from a pretty white Eurocentric framework, but understanding punctuality, avoidance of physical touch. And it's not to say we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but just being able to push on maybe some of the things that we've been trained in, and to relook at them through a more wider, culturally sensitive lens. Practicing cultural humility, Karen brought this in. So important that we have an understanding of our own identity statuses, recognizing that power accompanies these statuses, knowing how to detect when microaggressions occur. And, you know, microaggressions are also we often think of the big thing, but they can be an invalidation, like to take away. And I say that from my own experience in a training, that I was trying to join the person and instead I invalidated them. And so just constantly being open to hearing how we might show up and be experienced, even though we might not intend to. Attending to cultural issues and selecting and preparing group members and having the ability to respond in ethically responsible ways that can deepen connections. And it is a lifelong process. Thank goodness I love doing this work, and it's also really painful, but it's something that I'm invested in the long term. And those are just my references. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michele. This is such an amazing topic, and I feel like we can, with each of our presenters, we can speak for hours about this. So let's spend a couple of minutes for questions regarding the presentations that you just heard, and then we'll move into some examples from the audience so we can maybe work through, like, what can we do in our groups that we're running in real time, and how can we resolve some difficult situations related to diversity. So that being said, questions regarding, yeah. Okay, I see first raised hand. Vinny, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Just so excited. I'm sorry. Well, this has been incredibly wonderful to see all the models, and something that happened over the summer in one of the groups that I was running at the counseling center, which I hadn't experienced before, was when there was a microaggression taking place against one of the members of color. And a long story, very short, just a white and a black member, male, identified, both of them, had presented some thoughts. They were both senior group members and had really wanted to deepen things quickly. So they did the things that senior people do. But one was seen as aggressive in the way that they were doing it, and one was seen as like more intellectual or sophisticated in that. And so bringing that to the attention of members and having the curiosity around race being named on if this is playing a factor, having the black member push back and say, I don't think that's it, kind of immediately, I think took me aback. And so I guess what I'm thinking about and wondering from the panelists is how do you, like maybe in a major identity that you hold, push back, or at least continue to open up curiosity around that discussion if a marginalized or a person of a certain identity is maybe defensive around that discussion, or that being a sticking point?
Nobody wants to go. I mean, it's really tricky, Vinny. So the first thing that comes to my mind is to recognize that your intent was really good, and the impact on at least that person was like, no, I don't think that's it. But I wouldn't necessarily, again, throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, I appreciate that didn't feel like for you, but it can happen, and it does happen in our largest society. And so I'm wondering how other people might be thinking about what just happened here, because I'm wanting us to stay curious to what other underlying issues might be, and if maybe it might have not been for you so-and-so, but maybe it could have been based on what we know in our larger society that race often does play out. I'm interested to hear, because I don't want to put, especially as a white woman, I mean, I know you were leading the group, but if that were to happen in my group, I don't want to say like, I know, more than you, because that's not true. And their experience in that moment, it wasn't. But what we do know with racial identity models is based on lots of things, racial socialization, based on what environment in context they grew up in, based on their own development, if they were a first-year student versus a senior, and have been and I'm at a predominantly white institution. So there's all these factors. And so I would never want to put it on, but I wouldn't want to take it off completely either, because I think that would be giving everybody a pass and assume that gender doesn't play out. Like all these other things do play out. And part of what we're trying to figure out is, are they playing out in here? And some of you might think they are, and some of you might think they're not. But like, I don't know, just to kind of keep the curiosity. I'll stop there because I'm interested to know. But I you can tell the silence was like, is anybody going to speak? So I jumped in. Sorry.
Yeah, Michelle, I thought I saw a hand going towards the mouse, and I was like, oh, is she gonna? I was like, I don't know. I know my co-facilitator and I, we lean in, so I feel you there, not being sure who was going to respond. But I think this was, I agree with Michelle, a very tricky situation and dynamic. I think, you know, just the power in somebody being able to create their own narrative, I think is really important. Their power to say, this is what fits for me, this is not what fits for me in regards to my identity, to be able to voice that, to have that respected, and whatever that means for that person is really important. And so for me, there will always be a pull and desire to honor that, even if that's inconsistent from what I understand and may theorize with that person. I think for that particular individual, I would be really curious, like, you know, what is it like, you know, to hear someone say that perhaps you're being experienced as aggressive as a Black man, or the fact that we're even talking about aggression and we're talking about the intersectional identities of being Black and being a man. Like, what is that like that was even brought up for you? Because even if that's something that they don't agree with, perhaps they can talk about what that was like that was brought up for them. And I think that would probably give us maybe some more information. But that's just a hypothesis.
And Vinny, I had wanted to clarify which person, so the interaction occurred between two members. One member identified as white male and the other identified as Black male. Oh, okay, because I
may have not also explained it super well because I was rushing through.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, they essentially were doing that piece, the white male and the Black male member, both trying to deepen the group, trying to have people be in their emotions and vulnerable quickly. And certain people were making comments about how they were reacting to their pushing of that. And again, like one was seen as a very kind of like more intellectual, or really giving a lot of appreciation for the way that they were like trying to urge the group to go deeper. And the other one was seen as anxiety provoking or intimidating.
And I think that's what I wanted to clarify. Which one was which? Which one was seen as intellectual and which one?
The anxiety provoking, intimidating person was the Black identified male. That was who was being like signaled as that they were reacting to. And how I approached it was with a white female member that had stated that and saying, well, there could be a lot of reasons why you feel some intimidation. So I wonder, is it something around gender or tone or race? And when race was said, both of them said it's not race.
Yeah.
And so that was just very emphatic, the kind of pushback for both of them, the Black male member and the white female that were in that interaction.
Yeah. And for me, it's really hard to think of it when it's not in the moment, but I would more globally, kind of like what both Nathasha and Michele have alluded to, I would be in the moment, and I really like to use mindfulness. And sometimes when things are at an impasse in group, I'll just have everybody stop and check in with what their physiology is doing. Like, okay, what's happening with your heart right now? What's happening with muscles? Because I start off every single group with a mindfulness exercise, although I don't always call it mindfulness exercise because some people have said, I don't like mindfulness, don't ever use it. So it's just like, oh, you know, a grounding exercise. Let's bring ourselves into the present room. But yeah, I always just like, because for me, I love conflict. And I guess I'm white male-ish that way, but I love conflict because it's such an opportunity for growth when navigated in a useful way. And so if a conflict were happening in group and it just ended up being debating or arguing or whatever, that's when I explicitly might take a break and have people check in with physiologically what's going on, how are they feeling towards each other, all the members, how are they feeling, you know, and bring it to a group as a whole level. I mean, there's so many exciting things to do when something like that happens.
Thank you all so much for input. Just wanted to open up floor for other questions towards presenters, or if you have an example that you would like input on, feel free to unmute your mic and ask away.
I would love to bring an example and ask. I run the gender and sexuality group at my agency, and there is an ongoing, what I would consider microaggression from a transgender woman. She's white and she lives in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood, and she keeps making comments about the response of mainly men in her community to her. And to me, those comments have an aggressive flavor, and they're filled with kind of like coloring Latinx men as sexually intrusive. And I also saw Nathasha Aziza Platt's amazing presentation, and so it gave me some tools and courage. And last time she did that, I said, well, what do you mean by that? I kind of like played naive, and she was like, well, you know, I just feel easily attacked. And eventually she said something along the line of like, I'm a gentrifier and I feel guilty. But to me, that wasn't, on the one hand, I want to believe her. And on the other hand, it felt like she's saying the politically correct thing in order to not really address the aggression underneath her comment and the racism underneath her comment. Now, this group is kind of like rolling admission, and currently everybody is white. So there wasn't like a triage of like, who's the person who might be feeling personally offended, but there is this discomfort. And I felt just kind of bombarded with intersectionality, like what part of the identities in the room of a group that it is a very kind of broad range of LGBTQIA+ individuals. Currently, everybody identifies transgender in different stages of considering transitioning or transitioning. This is a person who fully transitioned and is living socially as a woman. So I kind of addressed it, but I felt like I'm blocked at a certain point and not knowing how to go any deeper. And I was wondering, I know I'm giving kind of like a snippet of a rich interaction, but maybe one of you have a thought, or maybe how you would address something like that.
So, Addie, I think that's another really challenging, situation in the group. And I think for me, I kind of can resonate what it's like to wrestle with something, particularly when you hear something maybe like group after group and you're like, okay, I kind of have to like really check in on this. And it could be a hypothesis that I have, and I could be completely wrong, but I'm picking up on something. And, particularly if you have a co-facilitator and if you all are talking about it, we're picking up on the same thing. I think that's where I might, take my own risk and ask for permission to explore, maybe ask for permission to challenge, and just kind of, tie it back to whatever the person's goal is. And to say like, when we met for your group screening, we discussed this. I see this coming up again now, as your, facilitator, I want to kind of like get your permission to see if we can check in on this and explore this a little bit more. Is it okay with you if I challenge you a little bit more in this area to go deeper? And hopefully there'll be a response in the affirmative. In many cases, when these students come to learn, it is, but I can definitely understand like the risk that comes with wanting to check in about that. Yeah, that's hard.
I mean, I'm going to go with Karen and this idea that stereotypes, biases, racism affects all of us. And I want to stay on this. I'm just thinking how, I'd like to stay on this and, because I think this is important given that all of you have marginalized identities in terms of in our society. And I'm just wondering, and I guess I'd kind of be thinking a little bit, I get some consultation as you are, but I'd be thinking about their transition from male to female, and what that, because I know working with trans people, when you transition to a female, all of a sudden you have these new experiences that you never had to experience before. And so I would just be curious around identity as it changes for them and all of them, and be able to maybe get it off of that topic if they're not biting at it, but just to be able to talk about in the transition, what privileges have become more salient as you've transitioned from male to female, or have become, you've become more marginalized as you've transitioned from that. And then how do you think that plays into race? And if you notice, we're an all white group. And so I'm curious, you know, what that means for us, and how we might not be able to understand, because we know that trans people of color experience marginalization much more than white trans people. And so, like, I would just kind of, you know, invite this trying to empathize with changing identity from one gender to another. And, you know, some are going to be non-binary, but that has marginalization attached to it too. And so that's what I would go with. I wouldn't, you know, if that person was like defensive, I think Karen's saying, you know, like going into the body and just saying, what are other people feeling right now? And if we were curious about that, why do you think you might be feeling heat? Or why do you think you might be feeling knots? Like, is it connected to something larger than your experience? I would just kind of open it up to more curiosity without, as you can see, I'm not linear. So just to see where it might take you. So that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I really am loving all the ideas, and it doesn't have to be linear. I'm like sponging it, and now I'm excited for her to do it again, which I have no doubt that she will.
It's difficult though, very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And I'm also nonlinear, and Michele and I, we are definitely spirit sisters or something. But what I would do, perhaps one thing I might do is say, oh, I notice I'm having some sort of response here. And I also want to point out I'm the only person of color in this room, because you said they're all white, right? And I don't identify as trans, and so I can't possibly understand anybody's experiences. So I'm just going to share from my perspective, and then I would share whatever I was noticing in that moment. And then I would probably say, so what's that like to have me as the leader or the facilitator share that? What's going on for you now? And then I would have to brace myself for potentially painful stuff, and that's okay. But that's probably what I would do, because I would have to share what I'm experiencing, and I might not think to ask for permission. So I might ask for forgiveness. Like I just have to share this and blah, 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 whatever it is. And then ask them, okay, so what's that like for you all? Something like that, yeah.
Another question from the
Thank you.
audience.
So,
Thank you.
excuse me, I do have a question. I think I asked in the chat. So I have been running a body acceptance group for all genders for a couple of years. So when I run this group for all women, I use the gender inequality and the feminism to empower my group members to resist the sociocultural pressure to pursue appearance ideal promoted by our society. And in the all gender group, I was trying to use the weight bias discrimination as sort of a replacement, and to really empower the group members, see that as sort of a systematic kind of oppression, so then they don't buy into this pressure. But I also noticed with all gender group, it always awkward whenever we talk about this gender inequality and the pressure to have certain ideal bodies. I just want to know what would could be like a better way to handle the intersection between gender identities and weight, size, and sort of in like all gender acceptance, body acceptance groups.
Okay, I'll start. I'm waiting on my colleagues. Do you guys have anything you want to say?
Oh, you can go ahead, Michele. I wanted to make sure that I had the question. Is the concern is about systemic oppression for all gender groups and how they experience body image?
Yes, I feel like in the all women group, and I have no concern. I can just talk about it openly, and but I feel like in the all gender groups, we can talk about weight bias and weight discrimination as sort of this weight and health. But then when there's always, we know there's more pressure for females, for women in this society, and for the body image. But I think whenever, like when we sort of talk about this intersection between gender identities and different pressures for different groups, I always feel as a group leader, it's hard because I want to take care of everyone's feelings and not like anyone feel targeted or, excluded. So I just want to get more sort of tips or help in how to handle those situations. Yeah, if that makes sense.
If I'm understanding you right, it sounds like you're asking how to help group engage in this open discussion about the gender identity and this body image and size, because it seems like what you're saying, this group kind of gets clamped up and are like struggling to go there. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, I think so, because when we talk about, sort of body ideals and things, and, I try to sort of ask, what would be sort of for women, for men, but then whenever, in those situations, and it tends to come up like the tension, and I can see particularly still in the all gender groups, we have actually more females than males, and the male participants tend to be quiet. And yeah, so I think that's more kind of situation, but also in general as well, like this intersection. And I always feel it's hard to deal with in group settings. I mean, I can deal with that in individual sessions, but it seems hard to deal with in group settings.
I appreciate the additional context. Michele, did you want to go first?
You can.
Actually even just borrowing from what Michele was saying earlier, as far as like specific questions that you might ask in the group screening, I think that was an incredible recommendation. And so knowing that if this is an ongoing challenge that comes up in these types of groups, to kind of bring that up in the group screening and saying that, we'll have these kinds of discussions in group where we're talking about, gender impact on, body image with a variety of gender presentations present, what would that be like for you? What would be challenging? How would you feel if I followed up with you and had questions for you in that space and challenged you to go deeper there, so that it already plants that seed that they know that those conversations are going to come up. But, it sounds like there's a group that you're in right now. And so if there is a group that you're doing right now that is having that issue, for me, I would probably be honest about the struggle that I'm having, and just be transparent about it. Sometimes what I do is I'll talk to my co-facilitator, and I will say, I'll talk about the fear that I'm having. It's like, I want to bring this up, or I'm noticing that this is happening, but people aren't really responding this way. I'm concerned that people might feel, fearful, or they might feel shamed, or they may feel like, defensive. And, you know, I just want to make sure that we're creating space for everyone to feel comfortable. And, you know, I hold concerns as a facilitator if I'm doing that in a way that's really best serving everybody in the group. And so maybe I would talk to the group about it, or maybe I would talk to the co-facilitator about it in front of the group. I'm not sure if you do have a co-facilitator, but those are just some strategies that I would consider.
And what I'm thinking of is, it makes me think of on that sheet that I shared about social identities, body size is on there. And people often don't think about diversity as including body size. And when I've done work with the group that I'm doing work with right now, the anti-racism, we all of a sudden had a discussion around this. And men are constantly being exposed to toxic masculinity. And toxic masculinity is around body as well. It's not just around how they show up in their personality or emotions, but also in how they look as a body. So I would again use that systems approach and saying that there's pressures and stereotypes of all genders, and how is that playing out in your lives? How is it playing out in our group here? You know, depending on, if you look at my size, there might be things that you feel about me because of me being, you know, an average size person. But I would start to bring more of the body in there and really talk about, let's talk about stereotypes. What stereotypes are out there? What biases are out there around body size for non-binary, for people that identify as male, for people that identify as female? And the other thing that I've really appreciated about doing online groups now is the ability to bring in new ways of new information. So like there's so many cool videos, and there's a series, I'll try to share it with Ksenia when she sends it out. It's these videos around intersectionality, and two of them talk about body type. One with disability, but one with their weight, and how they will always be a certain weight along with their racial identity. And so it just really, like if you showed a short video, they're like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and just say, what responses do people have? So I'm constantly utilizing now the internet and just doing a short snippet of something, because what it does is it evokes all kinds of reactions. And it gets the group going. And I would never have thought to do that when we're sitting in a room, because I just don't have, it's not there. But I'm trying to, I bring out the drawing thing now more. I'm just trying to be more, if it needs it, like if your group doesn't need it, you don't have to. But in that way, I might bring out a video that offline that shows about body size, and then have people respond to what reactions do they have? How does this apply to them, or does it apply to them, or have they thought about?
Thank you, Michele. I'm being cognizant of time that we have to wrap up.
Sorry.
I put in the chat the link to the feedback survey. It's pretty short. Please complete it for us. And once again, I will be sending out to all of you the link to the recording. It's probably going to be ready within a week, not right away. And whatever materials presenters are willing to share with us, I will also share that as well through the email. So thank you all so much for being here with us, and thank you to our presenters for your time.